Good afternoon, good afternoon. Thank you, thank you. My name is Patrick Terry, and I'm the CEO for the Columbus Council on World Affairs. It's such a pleasure to have each of you here today as we talk about a very important topic and country, one that's celebrating its 70th anniversary of the founding of its republic today. It's actually today for us, but sort of yesterday and part of today for China. I want to thank today's sponsors, Kegler Brown, Hill and Ritter, Vanita Mehra, if you'd raise your hand, and the Ohio State University's East Asian Studies Center, Ying Zhang, if you'd raise your hand, and we can clap to thank them for their support. Also like to thank Zach and the Greater Columbus Chinese Chamber of Commerce for your promotional support. We appreciate that. Now, I'd like to get us into today's program, which will feature a keynote and then some Q&A. We have note cards at your seat. So as you think of questions, write them down because we'll be collecting those later. To introduce us to today's distinguished speaker, I'd like to introduce a board member, Vanita Mehra, who's also from Kegler Brown, Hill and Ritter, our sponsor, one of our co-sponsors for today. The global business law practice at Kegler, which Vanita leads, has connected with companies across the globe, including the Asia-Pacific region, opening doors for U.S. companies and bringing new investments into Ohio. And Kegler Brown also works with educational institutions from across the U.S. to create and expand international student programs in some of the top markets like India and China. Kegler recently teamed with Columbus 2020 and Jobs Ohio, and we're joined by Governor DeWine to welcome a delegation of technology companies from India as they continue to promote economic development opportunities in Ohio. So it gives me great pleasure to introduce to you Vanita Mehra, who is also celebrating a birthday today. Thank you.
Thank you, Patrick. So now Patrick knows how dedicated I am to the board that I'm still here on my birthday, you know. But thank you, Patrick, for that introduction. Kegler Brown is always proud to sponsor an important event like this, especially alongside with the Ohio State University East Asia Studies Center. And I'm actually very honored to have this opportunity to introduce today's distinguished speaker. A little bit more about him a bit later, but let's talk about why are we here. The US-China have been battling over trade relations for the past year. Tariffs have been continuing to rise on both sides, hitting a variety of industries from agriculture goods to musical instrument, and most recently, even fuel. To help us make sense of all of this economic struggle for dominance and the larger political implication, the Columbus Council welcomes today Dr. David Bullman, who is the Assistant Professor of International Affairs and China Studies at the Johns Hopkins University School of Advanced International Studies. Dr. Bullman's background focuses on political economic development, with particular emphasis on the relationships between politics and career incentives in China and the role they play in China's economic growth. Today, Dr. Bullman will shine light on the Chinese perspective in this great economic battle we have been experiencing. He will help us to understand the root cause of this conflict, what it means for China, economy and the government, and the implication for the rest of the Asia-Pacific region, actually for the rest of the globe. Lastly, he will also help us to understand what this conflict means for us here in Central Ohio and how we have been impacted by it. So please join me in welcoming Dr. David Bullman.
Well, thanks so much, Vanita, for that kind introduction. And thank you to the Columbus Council on World Affairs for inviting me out here today. And of course, thank you to all of you for coming. I'm here today to discuss, as Vanita said, the roots and potential consequences of the growing economic conflict between China and the US. As a scholar based in DC, I'll try to inform my discussion from both a little bit of academic literature, but also sticking with policy relevance. With ongoing speculation today and in the last few weeks regarding an interim trade deal over the next few weeks, I'm going to try to take a step back to to provide a broader perspective on the bilateral economic relationship, how we've gotten to where we are, what effect this conflict is having in China and how that shapes the prospects for a future settlement, and how this growing conflict is playing out globally. All of this will lead me to provide some concluding advice on how the US should be responding to the economic challenge posed by China. Let me begin by just highlighting some of my major conclusions up front. First, as is now clear, the US-China trade war is part of a larger economic and technological conflict. It is not just a trade war, which is itself part of an increasingly adversarial geostrategic relationship. However, the different individuals involved in implementing the strategies that compose this economic conflict are not all on the same page as to what US goals actually are, with one group focused on the economic relationship, seeking to improve China's behavior and in doing so save the liberal international economic order, and another group focused on the security side of things, seeking simply to contain China's rise, while acknowledging that such efforts may have negative effects on the international order. These latter voices, I believe, are now in the ascendant. A second major point, in considering how we got here, we need to look at the broad structural issues at play. We cannot just blame Trump. Economic conflict between China and the US would likely have emerged under any president. However, the contours of this conflict and the potential for long-term damage are the direct result, I believe, of mismanagement of the conflict by both the Trump administration as well as by Chinese policymakers who overestimated their position. Chinese economic vulnerabilities should have made a deal possible, especially last year, but as we've moved to a deeper security-based technological conflict with fears of containment, the possibilities of a broad settlement is increasingly unlikely. Third, an economic Cold War is in nobody's interest, but that's the direction we seem to be heading. In the short run, the cost to the Chinese economy will be greater than those to the United States, but China has been very clear about its willingness and its ability to withstand these pressures. In the longer run, this decoupling will stunt global growth, undermine US global leadership, and lead to an increase in regionalism, with China likely at the center of an Asian bloc. Finally, I'll conclude with some thoughts about a way forward for US policy. I'll argue that the US has exaggerated both its own unilateral ability to shape China's behavior, as well as the threat that China's economy poses. In the longer term, the US and China would both be served by reformed global institutions, but the US will have to engage multilaterally and regionally if it wants to make these institutions effective. The US also needs a new approach to engaging economically with countries throughout Asia to respond to China's growing investment and interconnectedness. So, let me try to put some meat on these conclusions. Let's start with the current state of play and the deep roots of the economic conflict. Although tariffs have received the most media attention, the conflict goes much deeper than trade, reflecting rising competition and security fears related to cross-border investment, global governance, and technology. But tariffs and the threat of tariffs were the first step. The Trump administration's initial targeting of China's economic and trade policies was perhaps in some ways unsurprising. On the campaign trail, Trump referred to China's WTO accession as the greatest jobs theft in history, and he seemed to be raring for a fight. Yet, in the past, presidential hopefuls have often talked tough on China, while campaigning only to avoid actual policy shifts once they come into office. And I think that many China watchers in the US, and indeed America watchers in China, thought that Trump would fit this template. However, Trump was indeed different. He ratcheted up the rhetoric in mid-2017, and then began imposing unilateral tariffs in early 2018. These early tariffs on solar panels and washing machines, and then on steel and aluminum, were not targeted solely at China, but they were often seen to be targeting China, and China quickly responded with its own tariffs of 25% on 128 US products. I think this was a misguided response, as I'll talk about a little later. But then, through spring and summer 2018, the US ratcheted up tariffs, and China responded tit for tat. By fall 2018, the US was still ratcheting up tariffs, but China had stopped responding tit for tat and largely toned down its own rhetoric, largely because it didn't have enough products from America that it could continue to impose tariffs on. Despite a truce announced at the end of 2018 in Argentina, and high hopes for a broad deal in May of this year, the situation has escalated, despite the temporary truce over the last couple weeks. By December, if no deal is reached, Average Chinese tariffs on US products will rise to almost 26% from 8% at the beginning of this conflict. And similarly, average US tariffs on Chinese imports will rise to over 26% from less than 3% at the beginning of this conflict. So this is a massive change. But trade is only one front in this emerging economic conflict. And indeed, the technological conflict and the potential for financial conflict that we're seeing now are potentially much more worrying, particularly from the Chinese perspective. On the technology front, the US is clearly targeting China's supply chain vulnerabilities and its domestic production gaps. In 2018, US legislation increased investment restrictions, largely to block technology acquisitions, and also increased the US export controls. Both moves, while not explicitly targeting China, were generally perceived that way. More notably, direct sanctions and the inclusion of companies on the Commerce Department's entity list have highlighted the dependence on US technologies of many of China's leading companies, including ZTE, Huawei, of course, and Jinhua. More recently, we're also starting to see moves on the financial front. The decision by the US Treasury to finally label China a currency manipulator at a time when China is not as much of a currency manipulator by any means as it was a decade ago, 15 years ago, has been called the first step in a financial war by observers in China. There is proposed legislation from Senator Rubio that seeks to force greater disclosure requirements for Chinese firms listing on US exchanges, with the clear goal of causing a lot of these companies to delist. There are unverified reports that from last week that the US is considering just more explicitly asking all Chinese companies to delist. Taxing Chinese holdings of US assets is under consideration, as is barring US public pension funds from investing in China. And barring Chinese banks from US dollar payments clearing systems is no longer unthinkable, even though last year it would have seemed unthinkable. So how did we get here? Simply blaming Trump, I think, is insufficient. President Trump's unpredictability, his understanding of trade from a bilateral balance sheet perspective, and his self-professed penchant for deal-making definitely contributed to the way the conflict has unfolded. But economic conflict would have occurred under a Democratic administration as well. We should be clear that beyond Trump, a bipartisan narrative has emerged, especially since the global financial crisis, when perceptions of US decline grew and perceptions of China's rise and China's economic unfair competition also grew. Indeed, I should note that from my perch in DC, the only nice thing about this emerging conflict is the bipartisanship that it evinces, which seemingly harks back to a previous generation. Today, the dominant narrative in the US is that China's mercantilist policies have created a massive trade imbalance and harmed American industry through cyber theft, forced technology transfer, and subsidies for domestic firms. This narrative, of course, overlooks many of the significant benefits that the US has accrued, and it also exaggerates the role of Chinese mercantilism. Nevertheless, the distribution of gains from integration with China have indeed favored China, and certain sectors of the US economy have been harmed by integration and China's WTO accession, as the large China shock literature explains in depth. As China has become the world's largest trading nation, it has also become increasingly clear that the international economic architecture defining the post-World War II international economic order was not designed to manage China's form of state capitalism. As market reforms in China have stalled at the same time that China has become a much more influential player in global markets, this institutional shortcoming has become increasingly problematic. These broad structural problems mean that US-China economic problems will not miraculously be solved if and when a Democrat becomes president in 2020. And I think that anyone who watched the Democratic primaries a month ago, the primary debate, would see evidence of this as well in the responses to that candidates posed to questions on Chinese tariffs. But the greater challenge is that these economic and structural issues themselves are no longer even the key drivers of the economic conflict. Instead, the Trump administration has labeled China as a revisionist power and an adversary who needs to be confronted with a whole-of-society approach. From China's perspective, this means that the US is seeking to contain China's rise, which leads to an entirely new calculus regarding China's response to the US. Indeed, I believe that if conflict were or had remained purely economic and structural, a solution might still be possible, especially given China's large economic vulnerabilities. Today, there is considerable optimism about a short-term trade deal when Liu He visits town in less than 2 weeks, or visits DC in less than 2 weeks. I believe that there was an opportunity for a meaningful trade deal last year, but that this window is now closed, and I have very low hopes for the interim deal that might arise within 2 weeks, although it might benefit certain parties. I don't think it will. It'll be putting a Band-Aid on a much larger growing wound. To understand this perspective, we need to correctly understand the strengths and weaknesses of the Chinese economy, as well as how China has responded to various forms of US pressure. So let's take a step back. In addition to being Vanita's birthday, today is also China's National Day, October 1st. It's a big deal. This marks 70 years since the founding of the PRC. That means that the Chinese Communist Party has now been in power 1 year longer than the Communist Party of the Soviet Union ever served. As we arrive at 70 years, China has now spent 41 years in its reform era versus only 29 years in its Mao era. In this 4-decade reform period, China's GDP has grown faster than any other country on Earth. China now produces more patents than any country on Earth. It has the fastest supercomputer in the world. It just opened the world's most expensive airport, this Zaha Hadid-designed marvel, which is supposed to ease airport traffic at the second busiest airport in the world, which is just down the street in Beijing, or across town in Beijing. Yet despite all these plaudits, the Chinese economy is in many ways weak and vulnerable. And conflict with the United States has exposed many of these vulnerabilities, as well as some of the deepest fears of Chinese policymakers. We don't have time today to get into all of the causes of China's economic slowdown and economic weakness, but what I'd like to highlight is that China, in many ways, in 2008, saved the global economy and the Chinese economy through the world's largest monetary and fiscal stimulus package. But this package, despite its short-term benefits, led to an explosion in debt in China, as well as massive problems of misallocation of credit and investment. Economists like to talk about total factor productivity, which is basically all the growth that happens that we can't attribute to capital accumulation and labor accumulation. Such productivity growth from 1978 to 2008 propelled China forward, despite high levels of investment. But in the past decade, with investment now at stratospheric levels, total factor productivity growth has been negative. Part of this decline in productivity can be attributed in a bit to the resurrection and resurgence of the inefficient state sector, as we've seen people talking about the state advancing while the private sector retreats. But we should be clear that the state sector's resurgence has been driven as much by economic changes within China, emerging from the 2008 stimulus and subsequent stimulus packages to maintain growth, as it has been driven by a change in ideology. Today, China's growth is slowing down, debt is at seemingly crisis levels, and so far this year, tax revenue has been declining, which of course limits the potential for both monetary and fiscal stimulus. The trade war itself has already been quite harmful. Many private estimates in China now estimate millions of jobs that have been lost, and clearly as these numbers will only rise as tariffs become more permanent and more companies relocate offshore. As a middle-income economy, China is, of course, very vulnerable to growth slowdowns in a way that advanced economies are not. For 2 decades, China's leadership has talked about a strategic period of opportunity for development, and China's rapidly aging population means that this term is all the more relevant today, when China knows that over the next 30 years, its working-age population will decline by 210 million people, which is, of course, larger than the working-age population of the United States. Given China's vulnerabilities, I believe that both sides of the conflict have miscalculated and prevented a mutually acceptable deal from emerging. China by not pushing for an early resolution to the conflict, and the US for turning the conflict from a trade war that it could actually win to a security and technology war that will have no winners. On the Chinese side, China was extremely short-sighted in its management of the crisis. My own conclusion, based on many conversations in Beijing and in DC, is that China's miscalculations were based on a misunderstanding of Trump and of American politics, as well as a deteriorating domestic political environment that made the flow of information to top leaders break down. At conferences and meetings in March 2018 that I attended in Xiamen and Beijing with academics and some well-placed policymakers, this was right when China was considering its first response to the tariffs that Trump had imposed in January and February of that year. I was really shocked at how naive the signaling and messaging was. Interlocutors there all seemed to agree that Trump was just blustering and that a tough response was necessary to make Trump back down. So rather than appeasing Trump with some responses and maybe even superficial actions that could let him look tough, the Chinese doubled down. This resulting tough response, I believe, fed Trump's worst instincts and led him to listen to more hawkish voices in his administration, that many of whom have long salivated over the potential for a civilizational conflict. Rather than listening to the Cohns and Mnuchins in his administration, he began to listen more to the Navarros and Bannons. Trump therefore shifted towards a security approach to the conflict that targeted Chinese technology and access to global finance, making China believe that the US really did seek to contain China's rise. Interestingly, at the same time that China was responding aggressively, there was evidence of a broadening debate within China on the need for market reforms. Pro-reform voices at the time argued that market reforms were important for sustaining growth and avoiding a deeper conflict, and they took as historical precedent China's reforms in the lead up to the WTO accession. But as the trade war morphed into a tech war, this internal debate died down and more hawkish voices took over. The Trump administration correctly identified a Chinese vulnerability in targeting China's key technologies. China is highly dependent on US technological imports. Its largest single import is integrated circuits. Yet the move from a trade war to a tech war has neutered the effectiveness of the tariff strategy by forcing China to see the conflict as zero-sum. From Chinese policymakers' perspective, China has no choice now but to double down on attempts to achieve high technology self-reliance, as it's called. And of course, self-reliance is a term that anyone familiar with Chinese modern economic history knows much about. And China has also expanded efforts to support indigenous innovation. Given the deep roots of this economic conflict, rising security concerns and political mismanagement on both sides, the conflict is likely to get considerably worse, possibly leading to a decoupling scenario with negative effects on both countries, on regional and global trading partners, and on the liberal economic order more broadly. The broader positioning of China as a strategic adversary in the US makes a return to the status quo economic relationship impossible. And the unfolding of the economic conflict has ensured that a decoupling process is already underway. We are now in a scenario in which preparing for decoupling by firms and policymakers essentially leads to decoupling. Already, AmCham China surveys, as well as European chamber surveys, show that up to 40 or 50% of American and European firms are considering relocating production outside of China. And this process will continue with, even if a deal is signed, with continuing tariff uncertainty. Given the shifting narrative and deep underlying trends, it is difficult to anticipate where this conflict might end. I outlined some of the vulnerabilities of the Chinese economy earlier, but the US is of course not immune. A recent paper by Amity, Redding, and Weinstein estimates that about $20 billion in annual net losses are occurring due to consumer price increase on tariff goods that are not offset by tariff revenues because the US is shifting to higher cost imports from elsewhere. And of course, $28 billion has had to be committed to US farmers to offset costs, which comes from American taxpayers. DC, of course, does not have an agricultural or a manufacturing base. So where I'm from, we feel the conflict most clearly in terms of the political and security side of the relationship. But here in Ohio, you're at the front lines with exports of soybeans and auto parts of over $1 billion to China. I haven't seen recent data, but I imagine many people in Ohio are already suffering. Many exporters are suffering from the trade war. These direct trade costs will grow, but further decoupling will be much more problematic, harming global growth and the liberal economic order more broadly. Taken to its logical long-term conclusion, the decoupling scenario entails disintegrating and walled-off global production networks with massive supply chain movement away from China, the de facto and possibly the de jure end of the WTO, competing trade blocks with eventually a dollar block and a renminbi block, but that's a long time in the future, and aid and investment competition in the developing world as each side tries to get its block to enlarge at the other's expense. This is what Hank Paulson has referred to as an economic iron curtain. The US goal in this decoupling scenario would be to isolate China, but a more likely outcome is actually an increase in regionalism. Decoupling would force countries to choose their external orientation, standards, and supply chain integration, and it is not at all clear that the world's most dynamic region, Asia, would side with the US. Several Asian economies have already been hit very hard by this trade war. Malaysia, South Korea, Taiwan, Singapore. In many of these countries, the OECD estimates that they'll take a hit of up to 2% of GDP in the short term. In response, Asian economies have tried to move forward more rapidly with integration, most notably through the revised TPP, the CPTPP. And China is, of course, trying to bind countries in the region more closely to itself, largely through the RCEP free trade agreement that China is pushing. In a decoupling scenario in which these countries are increasingly forced to choose between China and the US, and producing for China with Chinese standards and producing for the US with US standards, it is clear to me that many Asian nations would gravitate towards China given geography as well as given long-term expected growth rates in both countries. Although today the US and EU still remain the largest source of global final consumption demand, China is a much faster growing market and is also more integrated with its neighbors. The US, EU, and Japan account for much less than 30% of exports from East Asia now, when in the 90s they accounted for well over 50%, and over 60% of trade in Asia is now intra-regional. In addition to regionalism, decoupling will of course undermine US global leadership, US global leverage and ability to influence countries outside of its own economic bloc would decline precipitously as WTO judgments were no longer binding, and as these countries no longer relied on the US market for external demand and no longer relied on US dollar payment systems. In the short run, decoupling would stall China's economic growth and technological development, but in the long run, it seems more likely that the US would lose its global leadership position and that an Asia for Asians would emerge, as Xi Jinping has talked about, with China at the center. With all this in mind, let me conclude now with a few thoughts on what US policy should be. Although we can't return to the status quo, it's not too late to avoid the economic Iron Curtain scenario that I've outlined. However, the US needs to be clear about its goals and priorities. If the goal, as now perceived in China, is indeed to contain China, this goal will fail. If the goal is to change China's economic behavior and maximize power and leverage, then the US needs a different approach. What can be done? I think first the US needs to acknowledge that even if all of the US security concerns are valid, keeping the conflict on economic terms is nevertheless most likely to maximize US power in both economic and security terms. China is simply too big and dynamic to effectively contain. Rather, binding China to global rules will be a much more likely way to achieve US goals. Taking this economic perspective, the most intractable problem in US-China relations and in Chinese relations with advanced OECD countries more broadly is the complicated state-market relationship in China that's both non-transparent and also undermines the market allocation of resources. The US needs to take multilateral approaches to shape Chinese behavior with regard to this state-market relationship, and it also has to take regional and multilateral actions to hedge against and provide alternatives to China's economic rise in Asia. It seems to me that much of US policy today is driven by two exaggerations. First, an exaggeration of China's economic strength, and second, an exaggeration of the role that unilateral US power can play in containing China. The first exaggerating, leading to these US policy mistakes, is that China's economy is unstoppable without US containment. As I highlighted earlier, the Chinese economy is quite vulnerable and is slowing down. More importantly, though, China's industrial policy simply does not seem to be that effective. The US and US policymakers seem all up in arms about China's industrial policy, especially the Made in China 2025 strategy. But these policies don't seem that effective. For instance, one paper that I'm working on with a colleague in China, as well as some former World Bank colleagues, looks at subsidies in China and where they're actually targeted. And it's very clear that subsidies at the local level in China are not targeted at emerging technological, highly dynamic actors. Rather, they're targeted at poor, loss-making SOEs, often private sector as well, but loss-making firms that are large and they simply don't want to fail, zombie companies. And this, as we show in the paper, is done for clearly political reasons, that the center-local problems that China has have not been resolved. Despite partisan agreement by Senators Warner and Rubio, the US needs its own industrial policy. Therefore, I think we don't need to be as scared of China's industrial policy as we seem to be. Rather, we should not exaggerate the China threat. China has its own house to deal with. US policymakers should instead try to incentivize China's market reforms. But the ongoing trade war, which should be doing that, instead targets private enterprises that are already bearing the brunt of Xi's statist inclinations, making reform in China less likely. And as I've discussed, focusing on security concerns and technological sanctions leads China to double down on its commitment to state capitalism. In the long term, only the carrots provided by international institutions can effectively pressure China to adopt market reforms. In terms of the second exaggeration regarding US unilateral capacity to shape China's behavior, Trump's hawkish advisors seem to agree that Reagan's tough guy approach in the 1980s led to the demise of the Soviet Union and that a similar strategy can be employed today. I'm not a Soviet specialist, but the economic and political science literature on Soviet decline now often sees Soviet decline as a consequence of failed economic reforms in the 1970s and early 1980s that could not shift the Soviet growth model from one based on capital-intensive labor surplus growth towards productivity growth. And indeed, it is the very shift that China is going through right now with all of its attendant challenges. Further pressure alone will not simply make China fold and spark regime change. That said, due to China's global integration and dependence, multilateral approaches could help to shape China's behavior. But this is not the approach that the US has been taking. Instead of working with the EU and Japan, the Trump administration has raised tariffs on them. The Section 232 steel and aluminum tariffs, based on trumped-up national security concerns, harmed our allies and made it clear that Trump was no fan of the WTO. The refusal to allow appointments to the WTO appellate body means that by December, the WTO will effectively cease to be able to adjudicate trade disputes. And partners, of course, in Southeast Asia like US rhetoric about a pivot and moving more investments towards Asia, but this so far has all been rhetoric under both the Obama and Trump administrations. This has not really hit the US pocketbook. If the US seeks to retain global leadership and bind China to the liberal order, it should instead seek to reform and strengthen the WTO. It should rejoin the TPP, and it should follow the lead of Japan and the EU last week in promoting an alternative to China's Belt and Road Initiative by offering new sources of money for infrastructure investment and for setting standards for global development. In sum, the US needs to become more involved with the world and not less involved. I hope next year that when China comes up in presidential debates, some of these more realistic positions are advocated rather than having a mere contest of China threat rhetoric. But I will just conclude by saying that I am not hopeful that that will be the case next year. So I'll stop there. Thank you very much.
Thank you so much, David. As he gets his microphone on, I want to remind people to grab the note cards. If you're near the note cards, would you just pass those around at your table, please? This will be how we welcome questions. If you just raise it up, we'll have someone come around and bring those up to me. Where do I begin? But I'm really excited to hear what you all have on your mind relative to China and this topic. But I'll go ahead and ask the first question to just get us going. You know, it's hard to make sense of particularly the trade challenges right now, but I'm curious to know from your perspective, you know, in the U.S. and in China, who are the winners and who are the losers? Maybe you could talk a little bit about that, both in the U.S. and in China.
Sure, thank you very much. You know, I think from the longer term perspective I'm taking, I think both sides mostly have losers, but it's very clear that tariffs can create short-term winners. Obviously, with early unilateral tariffs on steel and aluminum producers in the US could gain. So obviously you can look sectorally at where tariffs are targeted to find out which industries and subsectors are harmed and which ones are benefiting. I mean, if you take a broader macroeconomic perspective, when tariffs on China go up to 26% on average by December, that will start really biting into consumers in America and American pocketbooks in a way that earlier tariffs were targeted more on intermediate goods and things that were intended not to hit consumers as much. But that will have to change as we target the whole array of Chinese imports. On the China side, you know, I think there's an economic and a political way of looking at this. Definitely economically, exporters, private sector, small private sector exporters are hit the hardest. They're the ones that have already been working with the smallest margins and have the most to lose most quickly. And that's where we're seeing job losses. At the same time, you know, a stimulus program that China has tried to tone down its stimulus response to the trade war, but it still has had a small stimulus program, particularly in credit creation, but also in front-loading local government bonds. And in doing so, China is supporting the statist shift in the economy, the state capitalism shift. So this is moving through large SOEs rather than small private sector firms. And you see the rhetoric from Chinese policymakers is all about supporting private sector SMEs and getting bank loans to them. But you know, the actual state on the ground is if you have to get money out quickly, you're getting it out through large firms, through SOEs, and through local governments. So I think the loser in China is market reforms that are really difficult to implement in this sort of environment.
Got it. And so will the loser be the American consumer as well, coming into the fall?
Yeah, I mean, I think already we're seeing that prices are rising. That was the Amity, Redding, and Weinstein paper. You know, the numbers are relatively low given the size of the U.S. economy, and given how tariffs have been targeted so far, that you haven't seen too much of an increase in consumer prices yet. But we're seeing a partial increase in consumer prices, and definitely we will see a much bigger increase come December.
Great, thank you. Wow, we've got questions that are torn in half. Thanks for reusing the paper and using both sides of it. I appreciate that. This one gets towards the politics that are happening here in the U.S., but how does a potential impeachment play into a pathway forward and resolution?
You know, I think it's a great question, and you all know American politics as well as I do, so I probably shouldn't be the one answering, but it seems, you know, there's obviously speculation that Trump feels now that there's more of a need to have a deal before 2020 For various reasons, if you want to deal before 2020, the most likely time for that to happen is this fall. So I think that's why there's a lot of optimism in much of the economic and financial press about reaching an interim deal on the 10th and 11th of October, or at least start setting the stage to reach an interim deal that can be signed in November, due to the need on both sides to have a win. China with having to deal with what's going on in Hong Kong and the slowing economy, the US with, again, some more economic pain here, but also the impeachment. So I think that there is a sense that an interim deal might be signed. As I tried to outline, I'm not even sure that this interim deal will actually happen, given the wide gulf between the two countries in what they're trying to achieve. But I think even if an interim deal is signed, this will be along the lines of the sort of truce that we've seen earlier. So we won't raise tariffs as much in December, but that doesn't mean they won't be raised in the spring or in the summer next year. So I don't see I see the need for a short-term political victory that does not have very many long-term consequences.
Got it. Thank you. Here's another question referring to a recent report that the U.S. is considering restrictions on Chinese investments. What are your thoughts?
My thoughts on whether this will happen? I think it would be escalating so drastically. I think there's restrictions on Chinese. Let's separate the question. I think the recent reports have been more about restrictions on U.S. investments in China, I feel. Obviously, since the FIRMA legislation last year, and even before FIRMA, when we were just using CFIUS to block Chinese acquisitions, Chinese investment cratered from 2016. In 2017 it fell, in 2018 it fell a ton, and this year it's falling further. So I think Chinese investments in the US are clearly unwelcome, particularly in technological sectors. That's not changing anytime soon. I think the big thing that's being discussed now is how we can limit China's access to US financial markets. And that was the Senator Rubio legislation that he's proposed on stricter reporting requirements, which actually in many ways would have been good legislation, especially before these companies listed. But the effort is to get many companies to delist. And now I think the speculation on preventing pension funds from investing in China would be a huge deal and really escalate this conflict towards that sort of more decoupling scenario that I've talked about. I don't think the Trump administration will be willing to do that in the short term, despite talk, but I'm always surprised. So maybe it could happen, but that would be really escalating this to a whole new level and would have really severe consequences on the Chinese economy, which now relies on many of these systems, but also the US economy and pension returns.
Here's a question, talks about China currently accounts for over 90% of the world's production of rare earth minerals used in just about anything electronic. What leverage can this become for China as they seek to negotiate with the US and the rest of the world?
I've been pessimistic on a lot of things. On this one, I'm not worried at all. I think that rare earths, the US has stopped production of largely because they're highly polluting and a real pain to take out of the ground. It's not that we don't have rare earths here. We've definitely so in 2010, in the East China Sea, a Chinese fishing captain rammed into a Japanese boat, and Japan, of course, took him in, and China responded by a soft ban on rare earth exports to Japan. Right? It never officially announced because that would be against WTO rules, but it basically stopped exporting rare earths to Japan. And since then, the US and Japan and Canada, many partners, have actually started to consider how we can replace Chinese production of rare earths with domestic production. This hasn't gone as far as it should. Of course, we're behind the curve. But I don't think China really has the scope to affect the US economy for more than a short-term shock to rare earths. I also think that China's main goal right now is to keep the international economic system working to its benefit, and explicitly blocking rare earth exports to the US would just undermine any credibility China had to be the preserver of this international system. So I don't think China will do that.
All right, this one gets to some of the politics we were hearing about today in China, particularly with Hong Kong. And the question is, with growing regional challenges and security, coupled with the pushback in Hong Kong in two parties, one system, what is the likely response to military action from China towards Taiwan? And is this inevitable given the increased rhetoric and push to force US military influence in Asia?
So if I understand the question correctly, it's what does the situation in Hong Kong mean for military action in Taiwan? And I'm not going to pretend to be a military expert by any means, so I should probably keep my mouth shut. But I think that What's going on in Hong Kong has clear effects on the Taiwan election that's coming up. And it's definitely made Tsai seem to be a stronger candidate than she had been before. What's going on in Hong Kong? Xi Jinping has very much talked about the need to reunify Taiwan. People tend to see that as meaning that Taiwan needs to be reunified before the second centennial anniversary, which is 2049. So there's still quite a bit of time before that. But I think prospects for military intervention, we're not talking about an invasion tomorrow by any means, but what's going on makes the chance of a peaceful reunification much lower, I guess is all I could say on that.
Yeah, diplomatic. Can you talk a little more about the hows and whys of the impact of the U.S.-China trade wars on other Asian countries like you mentioned? Like Malaysia. Thanks.
Sure. So there's talk that some of these countries will benefit because production will relocate to Vietnam or other countries in the region. And clearly there's some possibility for economic benefit when that relocation happens. But these countries are very much intertwined in production networks. So most of their exports to China are part of global supply chains that often then get passed on to the US. So we're seeing now, the Taiwanese economy being hit the hardest when Taiwan's intermediate exports to China are more impacted than China's overall exports to the US, for instance. So you're seeing a huge decline in exports to China from these Asian countries. And that process is only bound to continue. A lot of these countries produce for final demand in the US through China. So this is clearly impacting them, and it's why they're trying to integrate further with other countries in the region to make sure that supply chains are viable that don't necessarily go through China. If we're talking about overall any specific country and overall economic hit, it's tough for me to give a very specific response on that. The countries I mentioned are the countries that seem the most worried. Singapore, South Korea, Malaysia, and Taiwan seem to be impacted the most negatively so far. There's been, Vietnam has actually had some gain from this, although on net probably zero gain, but relocation of firms from China has been much more to Vietnam than it would be to a Malaysia or South Korea where wages are actually higher than in China.
Should the U.S. have joined the TPP, and will China join the TPP? Will China benefit economically from more work in African and South American countries?
Sorry, so the first part on TPP, and what's the second part of the question?
So will the U.S. join TPP? Will China join TPP? And then will China benefit from more work in African and South American countries?
From more work in? Okay. So on TPP, I clearly think that the U.S. should have joined TPP. I think, as I mentioned, one of the most difficult challenges with China is its state market relationship, the way it gives non-transparent subsidies to firms. The WTO was not really designed to deal with this. The WTO was designed with the expectation that developed economies would move towards more market-based systems. That didn't happen, so the U.S. actually, explicitly was targeting China with TPP. Now, there's debate within U.S. policymaking circles as to whether the targeting was excluding China from TPP and thus weakening China, or setting up this large WTO-like carrot for China to join TPP, which would make it change its domestic state market relationship, moves towards competitive neutrality, as China calls it, which is treating SOEs and private sector firms the same. I think that latter, trying to exclude China from TPP should never have been the goal. The goal should have been to try to expand TPP to include China on the terms that the U.S. sought. I still think that's the best move. I think TPP has been signed with the hopes that the U.S. will come back in. Of course, that's just a political non-starter in the U.S. right now on both sides of the aisle, and Democrats and Republicans alike don't talk about rejoining TPP. But I'm hopeful that maybe the situation will change as we trend back towards more multilateralism. Will China join? It seems more likely that China would join than the U.S. right now, although China would have to have a lot of domestic reforms, and it's not clear that would be in China's interest right now, especially given the trade conflict. But many fairly influential voices in China, people like Yuan Ding, who's a really influential economist in China, have been advocating joining the TPP as the best way to move China forward. So I don't think either country is joining soon. I think the U.S. should join. I think China is maybe more likely, but still fairly unlikely to join. I'm not as clear about the question about China's interactions in Latin America and Africa. I think that China, if you look at Pew Global Report, just had its most recent, every year they look at perceptions of China around the world. It's very clear that in Asia, perceptions are widely mixed. Some countries are very pro-China, think China's doing great things for the global economy in the world. Some countries are very anti-China because they see a China threat from China's rise. In Europe and the US, perceptions have almost entirely trended more negative, although in Eastern Europe, there's a bit of a pushback on that. But in Latin America and Africa, perceptions are quite positive. Despite talk here about debt trap diplomacy and China trying to make, trying to be a neo-colonialist in these two continents, the funds that China has available, the expertise it can provide in infrastructure development are things that the US and EU and Japan have not been providing in these continents. So I think China's been very wise about its investments in Latin America and Africa, and the US really needs to consider a better response rather than just going to these countries and saying don't accept money from China, right? I mean, you need an alternative, not just a bashing.
Can you speak on recycled materials going to or from China from the US?
Short answer, no. I know that China.
Is there a long answer too?
I'm sure there is. I know there's fascinating things going on with China deciding that it didn't want to take recycled products from the U.S., but that was before the trade war, if I'm not mistaken. So I shouldn't say something that's completely wrong. So I'll stop there.
Got it. We also had a question around how do you think Russia will influence the outcome in the U.S.-China relationship?
That's a great question and tough to answer. I mean, historically, the China-Russia relationship has been much worse than the China-US relationship. So I think most people that follow China's IR and US-China relations have generally not seen too much of a prospect of Russia-China collaboration. And I think especially now that China's economy is 10 times the size of Russia's and Russia is much more dependent on China, structurally, the idea that these two countries want to join together to oppose the US seems a bit far-fetched. That said, really well-placed people looking at the China-Russia relationship have seen a much closer knit ties between the two countries. They're obviously opposed to U.S. moves towards unilateralism. The U.S. since 2010 shifting from primary sanctions on countries to secondary sanctions that target companies in Russia and China and elsewhere have not been well received, obviously, in these two countries. So there's a much greater prospect for them working together to counter some U.S. policies. That said, their interests are, except for the interest in combating what they would call, U.S. hegemony or unilateralism, their interests are highly divergent still. So they're not going to be, a relationship as close as lips and teeth like China and North Korea. But I think there's a prospect for more development than we thought.
Thank you. Do you have more serious concerns on security of the country and the threat to the world than on trade deficits under the Chinese regime?
I do. I think that the direction that the Chinese regime has gone in the last several years has definitely not been positive. I think that there are clear concerns about what's going on in Xinjiang and other parts of China and political repression. I think that the shift towards a surveillance state, as some would say, is also quite worrying and dangerous. However, I don't think dealing with China by trying to contain it through economic means is at all effective. I think it makes China double down on many of these negative policies in ways that are not effective at making China change their policies. We simply don't have the capacity to fully contain China. If we want to change China's behavior, we need to work globally to do so. So I'm worried about the security trends. I'm not a military expert. I'm not a cyber expert. I think there are a lot of things going on in the military and cyber realm that are worrisome, but I don't think economics is the way to deal with these problems.
Got it. Okay. How has the China-US trade tensions impacted the education sector, specifically Chinese student recruitment to the US?
It's a great question, and some of our representatives from Ohio State here today might have more insight. I mean, at Hopkins, we haven't seen numbers go down. I think there's clearly concerns among Chinese American and Chinese scholars that their work, especially in STEM fields, is being unfairly analyzed, and that the environment for their work is much more difficult. The Chinese Ministry of Education has said that the U.S. is not as attractive as a destination as it used to be. Will that have an effect on Chinese students coming to the U.S.? We haven't seen it too much yet. I think, again, there's people in the audience that probably know much more about actual enrollment trends. At Hopkins, we haven't seen a shift down. But the threat that will happen is, I think, looming over academia in the U.S. immensely. Clearly, we depend in large part for revenue on Chinese students and international students, as well as for the intellectual dynamism of our universities. And when you have intelligence agencies saying that 1 in 10 Chinese students are spies, that's not giving you much confidence that will keep the doors open to Chinese students coming. But so far, I don't think there's been that much of an impact, but it's a huge fear.
Yeah, right. Is there anyone from the audience that wanted to address that for Ohio State University?
Well, the numbers were growing rapidly for the last 5-6 years, but they started to slow down growth, and statewide the numbers have started to decrease in other state institutions.
Got it. So for those of you that didn't hear that, there's been a rapid growth over the last 5 years plus of specifically China enrollment, and it's starting to slow down, and in some institutions beginning to go down. So thank you. There's a couple questions here about, well, let me read it. One is, I think, funny. Can regional players such as provinces, states find opportunities to collaborate while national leaders on both sides bicker?
Yes, I think that's long been a trend where governors in the U.S. are much more supportive of the economic relationship with China than national policymakers and politicians. I just found out today that there's a 40-year-old sister relationship between Ohio and Hubei. So I think that clearly these regional relationships are very important, and especially in China, where the center, I think, has much less control over the provinces and prefectures and counties than is often acknowledged. There's a lot of scope for enhanced investment and enhanced relationships. That said, if the environment gets much worse, then those will be impacted as well. I mean, those without national support, the regional relationships themselves can't support the relationship.
Are you familiar with China's 1,000 Talents program, and do you see any effect of that program affecting the technology transfer from the U.S. to China?
I'm familiar. I don't have details on how it's affected technology transfer. I know that I think 7,000 people have been recruited back to China in various fields. Clearly, that has helped with technology transfer. But in my mind, a lot of that transfer is more market-based than just this state capitalism and China stealing secrets. I mean, this is recruiting people who have gotten an education in the U.S. to go back to China and work. If it weren't called 1,000 Talents and led by the Communist Party, we would see this as a normal, attractive program to bring back talents. I mean, I think in many ways, yes, we see these things as problematic for technology transfer, and they are somewhat worrisome, but this is not stealing trade secrets. This is bringing back people that have expertise, so I don't find it as worrisome. I think the U.S. has benefited much more from Chinese scholars in the U.S. that have stayed in the U.S. than those mere 7,000 scholars who have returned to China.
Great. Will blocking China from U.S. dollars payments impact U.S. dollar standing as a global reserve?
Yes, but unclear how rapidly. China has been promoting renminbi internationalization since just after the financial crisis. It was included in the IMF special drawing rights in 2015. But renminbi use is now much lower today than it was 4 years ago. So yes, I think that clearly, and as I outlined, I think if we move towards decoupling, which this sort of move towards blocking Chinese companies from U.S. dollar clearing systems would push us towards, the time it would take for renminbi internationalization to serve as sort of an offset to that would be a long time. But I do think it's a long-term shift that you would have more of a regional renminbi block. That's the natural path forward. In some ways, crisis could precipitate that in some ways, because crisis might actually make China's capital controls less likely to be binding, and when China's capital controls fall apart, that's when renminbi internationalization can actually take off more. So I think there's a lot of dynamics that are intertwined there, but yes, in the long term, I think it would lead to a lack of dollar hegemony around the world.
How would you recommend us as consumers, as citizens, what can we do? I mean, it's a complicated issue with lots of angles and dimensions to it. What recommendations would you give to us, the average person, maybe working in something related, maybe just being a citizen? what would you recommend to us as a path forward?
I mean, I think as a consumer, there's not much you can do than keep basing your consumption decisions on pricing and markets. In terms of as a citizen, you know, if you agree with what I've said, that a multilateral approach makes more sense than trying to elect people that favor a multilateral approach and think that the U.S. has more to offer than just being America first and being inward looking. I mean, we're at a Council on World Affairs, so I think most people here probably have more of that view. But clearly the shift in the U.S. is toward more inward looking on both sides, both the Democratic and Republican side. But if we want to successfully deal with the threat that China poses from the economic side or the security side, we really have to deal with the U.S. position in the world before anything else.
Great. Ladies and gentlemen, please join me in thanking Dr. Bullman.
Thank you.
I did want to let you know that you'll be getting an email soon about a program we have coming up in December about the disinformation war. And as we enter the election season, I'm not sure when that starts and ends, but you'll find that to be most interesting. So once again, thank you all for joining us. We are adjourned. Thank you.